All right, thanks for showing up for the last class. We're going to try to land this crazy airplane that we've been trying to build as we fly it. I don't know, Jonathan, do you want to start out with some thoughts?
I'm happy to. I was thinking we should start a new MIT tradition by ending every class with a disclosure of where the MIT nuclear reactor is. Then I realized we are being recorded for posterity and live streaming, so that would be bad to share. So instead, I wanted to share a few thoughts about what we had in mind when we started planning this class. And it may nicely connect to what you might want to have in mind as you work on the paper or other product for the class. And part of what I think we've been thinking about from the start, at one point Andrew Graham, who was the master of Balliol College and one of the people who started the Oxford Internet Institute, he had this kind of thing where he would say, interdisciplinary is just skimming on the top of a bunch of random things. Multidisciplinary, that's what we're about. And it had this kind of like, I never quite thought of prefixes for the word disciplinary before. What other ones could there be? Nanodisciplinary, we really get detailed. But I've been thinking a little bit about inter and multidisciplinarity.
We use antidisciplinary, by the way.
Antidisciplinarity.
Yeah.
Which is a discipline.
It's all that does not fit in the disciplines.
All that does not fit in the disciplines. Kind of a dumpster diving of academia, really.
It's the way we describe it, Ed describes it, a discipline, like it's the old adage, drunks look for the keys under the lampposts.
Yes. And
we carry flashlights and look for the keys between the lampposts. That's the antidisciplinary space, where federal funding.
And what's your level of sobriety?
Well, it doesn't actually matter because it's often the keys are sitting there right on the surface. It's basically where the federal funding and the journals don't shine. And I do think that this class has a little bit of that because I think there's an interesting trade-off, and I just will riff a little bit on what you said. I think it's important to be obviously deeper than just the mainstream media, but there's a lot of, I don't want to use the word low-hanging fruit, but there's a lot of opportunity, let's say, in discovering somewhat obvious things once you take off the mantle of having to think about how you're going to describe this to your peers. And also just the internet section, like just the last class where, I can't remember who it was, but it said, have you thought about the question about, I think it was Jonathan, it was, why do we need cars? The fact that you're giving us a trade-off where both sides of the trade-off involve some car or jaywalking. So I think the ability to go meta, there's a risk that you get thin, but I think right now when you're trying to reframe fundamental things, it's really important. And I think, to me, we use the word antidisciplinary.
I like it. And I wouldn't want to be anti-multidisciplinary. There's a real value if you can master a bunch of fields and tie them all together. It's just often that's a seriatim process of by the time you've earned your 6th PhD, you're like, now I'm ready to study. And that's a problem for an individual. I say this as somebody who's been thinking about internet issues specifically and technology issues generally for many years. And then I behold something that should be squarely in my wheelhouse, and I'm like, I don't know. Like, it's hard to know how much what you've learned in a discipline ultimately can really apply. And there's the other risk that often disciplines weirdly correlate a certain area of inquiry. We're going to study the human mind with a way of doing it. Like, if you're doing experimental psychology, like, this is what it is. And I think that gets to your lampposts point.
Yep.
And we want to be able to have areas of inquiry that don't themselves immediately define a particular methodology of how you'd ask the question.
And to use a more science thing, sometimes you have 3 disciplines looking at the exact same thing on different microscope settings. And then they can't talk to each other because it looks very different at the molecular scale and at the cellular scale and at the organism scale. And it was interesting because I went to meet a professor that our philosophy students introduced me to, and she was scribbling all this stuff on the wall using philosophy logic around bias, around reasoning, around decision making. And I didn't understand it, but I intuitively got that she was talking about a lot of the things that
And some would think, by the way, philosophy logic is redundant. Yeah.
but
You're using that philosophy logic on me. Yeah. It's called deduction. Yeah.
But she was describing it in interestingly mathematical ways that looked more like engineering than law. When you think of philosophy more feeling like a humanities, social sciencey thing. And so what's interesting, I think, is an expansion to this class, and we have, again, not just engineers and lawyers here, is to think about how other disciplines are thinking about the things that we've been talking about here, and what frameworks or epistemologies we can take from those to then better understand those. Because again, I think, sort of by definition, we're trying to be a bit reductionist because we're trying to simplify and understand the bigger picture. But there may be other tools to do that design that we haven't yet tapped.
And the reductionist point too, for an individual, I think it means partially, what do I need to learn from an adjacent or not even adjacent field that I don't know, or who do I need to draw in to tackle this question in a reasonable way? And what do I need to unlearn? What blinders have my fields put on me that I'm trying to escape? And it may mean that you need to talk to somebody from a completely different field who asks a question that sounds like, oh, well, we lawyers don't worry about that. And it's like, well, wait, why don't we? Yeah. Is a really good question. And it also gets to institutionally, how do you build an anti-disciplinary or interdisciplinary institute that is a whole greater than the sum of the parts? If you're multidisciplinary, it's easy. You call it a university and just have departments. I assume MIT is multidisciplinary, so is Harvard. But
it's the difference between a multicellular organism and a colony of cells. To use another metaphor.
It's a good adjustment of your microscopic setting for that. Which is the one I favor? I favor the first. A colony of cells seems much less, or do I favor the second? I want a multicellular organism, right?
You want a multicellular organism. But anyway, I think that's the edge of that metaphor.
Yes. Joey's about to start talking about cephalopods. And now I'm trying to remember how to pronounce eukaryotic.
Yes.
Which I think I just did.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Check. So in teaching a class like this, one that is multidisciplinary, individual to individual, many of you come from already some training, often autodidactic. In CS, a lot of people teach themselves or apprentice long before they get to formal training. Some of it through law or philosophy, and how to productively have conversations around tables like these or asynchronously is part of the challenge, and it's never too early to be working on that kind of thing. And when it comes time then to think about a paper, I think our greatest hope is to be able to write something that feels authentic and relevant, is not just a pro forma exercise, and that takes you a little bit beyond where you would be if your paper were written specifically and only for the discipline that you might most identify with. If you're a lawyer, what's the piece of it that doesn't just make it a standard law review kind of note? If you are a machine learning background, is there an ethical or normative, as we lawyers say, an ought policy dimension that you normally wouldn't be asked to tackle, in fact, would be banned from tackling? I just had a co-authored paper with a number of people here on the entropy of the DNS space, how DNS, domain name services, despite the fact that you can specify more than one DNS resolver for your domain, a backup in addition to the regular one, more and more companies and other people with websites don't do that, and they put all their eggs in the same basket of like 2 DNS providers, which is a little crazy from an ecosystem monoculture point of view. And I wanted in the title of the paper to say, like, this is bad, like this is a danger, we should, and like NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research down the street, world regarded, was like, we love the paper, we definitely wanted the series, but you have to change the title to simply declare that there is a ticking time bomb on the front door, that is all. You may not say that you should probably diffuse it or don't open the door, like leave that for the reader to infer from the ticking sounds, which is, again, a very interesting way of thinking about it. And NBR, of course, has its reasons, as to wanting to be nonpartisan and such. And I think we're wanting to help you get into the weeds. So that's our highest hope for your paper. And it's also working backwards from that, in some ways given us a sense of what to take up when we gather each week is an attempt at a concrete problem tied to maybe something that's achieved a label in what is coalescing as a field, bias in algorithms, say, and to just have a chance to work it through a little bit, enough to give you a taste of what it might be like to go further into that field. And if anything, our kind of evil plan after this is to explore the possibility of actually offering a joint degree program between our institutions that would be something like a 2-year double master's program that would, in its worrisome output, generate people who know just enough to be dangerous and are like, I'll tell you about the law. I took a class in law. And that would not be great. And there was a moment, Joey, when you asked me for this class on Coachella weekend, which is what we were calling that opening weekend for reasons only I know and I don't know. But there was a moment where in that weekend you were like, we should do 3 hours of law tutorial just to get everybody like on the same page about the law. And I was like, huh.
But you said the same about an AI tutorial.
I did. I did. It just seemed important to stay symmetrical here, so keep people comfortable.
Yeah.
So yes, I would like a 6-hour day in which we cover law and artificial intelligence. So aware again of our modest moment here as a 2-credit seminar, where we're just in a position to read evocative stuff, bring to bear what we already know in ways that hopefully push us, and then point us to not only what would be a cool paper to write, again, not a huge onerous 65-page paper, but something that contains like a real, here's some ideas, here's some pointers to stuff that I haven't yet seen either in what's been presented through the course or in a decent search of people thinking around the topic.
And I don't want to overstate this, but because we're seeing this in real time, Zuck is presenting right now, all these things are happening that didn't exist at the beginning of the class. The readings, in a way, are already way outdated. And to use my streetlights metaphor, this intersectionality that we have right here is really there are no journals or funding or things in the space. And so there are a lot of keys out there. There are a lot of things that probably no one has actually rigorously written about. And I don't expect that everyone will find some brand new thing, but I think we're sort of at possibly the birth of a new discipline or an interdisciplinary thing. And so I think the stretch goal is to try to find something that maybe is occurring in another discipline that you can describe using your discipline better, or maybe there's an intersectional thing, but I'm sort of restating what you said, but stretch for something that one might help us as we read them in thinking about how we might frame a new joint degree, how we might think about this class next time, but also, is this a whole new field of study? Can we take history of science and mash it up with the way engineers are working? And so how can we turn that discussion between you and Iyad into so we saw the difference. So then what would be the solution to that problem? The problem that when you create a bunch of trade-offs, you're already being normative. So how would you inform that process, and what would that look like? So I think we have an opportunity to really, both from a project perspective and a discipline perspective, come up with pretty new stuff.
And you brought up Mark Zuckerberg's testimony, which I think may be happening as we speak.
Yep.
And that's a kind of good opportunity to think about the role of academia in matters that people think, at least at the moment, have great moment to them. And it's not always, I think, the place of academia to concern itself with that. John Rawls wrote a theory of justice. It didn't need to be like, here's what Facebook should do. But there are others who can draw on something as foundational as that, or any number of other theories, and say, here's what Facebook should do. And one of the reasons we thought it might be interesting to assign what turned out to be Sunday's editorial that I did, and a kind of corresponding document that Joey wrote about technology in the Valley, is because, as it happens, I think the Facebook situation with Cambridge Analytica is a really nice wedge into a synecdoche of the entire sweep of kind of the syllabus of the course and the topics we've been talking about. So what we thought we would do for nearly the balance of this session is in a kind of structured and decently rigorous way, as a group, try to work through the issues that we perceive in Facebook. And you have, as I think, at least one starting point, my own op-ed, which was already chopped in half in order to get published. There's a lot left on the floor, which
You can now say.
which I can now say, but was an example of one academic trying to offer up a bunch of stuff. And it was actually apparently just like moments ago, Senator Schatz asked Mark, like, so what do you think about this information fiduciary thing that Jack Balkin has been talking about? And Mark was like, yeah, Jack Balkin's great. And that appeared to be the answer to the question, which is true, but not entirely responsive to it. But that's the kind of thing where as Congress starts thinking about how it might legislate, and in fact starts thinking about what questions should it ask Mark tomorrow because he bounces over to the House, that may or may not be something for us to take up. So I would love, is there more you want to be saying on the general introductory front?
One thing, very housekeepy thing. So I think Harvard for the first time, MIT as a standard tradition, the course survey assessment happens online. Last year we distributed papers and we got 100% response, which was really great. In other classes where we do online, the response has been poor. There's an old saying from my friends at Goldman Sachs. They say at Goldman we never beg unless it helps. And so I think I want to beg because the response and the feedback is tremendously important, both for understanding the class, but as this class is, I think, going to be a key class in us figuring out, do we do this again? What are the joint degrees? Does making lawyers and engineers actually work? And if it does, in what way? If it doesn't, in what way? So the response is really important, both in the conversations we're going to have with administration, as well as us trying to redesign the class. And so I know Natalie will be nagging people. Our surveys for MIT go up at like May 7th, so you have plenty of time to forget. So that's my concern, is that you'll get all energized and then it'll peter off. I just want to spend this time to urge you to try as hard as you can to remember and to fill out the surveys because they're tremendously important. They're not just for us. It gets entered into our system and important people look at it. So
yeah, into permanent records, and then inferences are made about it to serve up specific advertising both to Joey and to you.
Yes,
and to me as well.
And it's in our CVs too.
Yes,
so.
That's right. That's right.
So if you want to hurt us or help us, you can do that too. But anyway, that's my pitch. Please fill those out. And now on to the main program.
Great. All right, so let's start to try to unpack in a way that by the time we're done, we're hoping it will feel like we've gotten to a place beyond, say, where my op-ed was, or Zeynep's op-ed, for which I don't know if it was in her op-ed, that specific one, but she wrote another one for the Times, maybe just today, that was said, what should Mark Zuckerberg be asked? Answer, nothing. There's no question to ask Mark Zuckerberg. Don't have this kind of savior syndrome about one guy should come in and fix it. The whole system is screwed up, and here's what we should do about it, which I think results in we've got to get rid of this ad ecosystem that depends on total surveillance, as best I can summarize Zeynep. But maybe we can switch the screen over to a Google Doc that Samantha will control, and I can read as we go. And maybe you can embiggen the text in some way. Maybe there's a way to go as full screenish as possible too, since so much real estate is devoted to iconography and.
I think you can use a little
full screen.
You can. Oh yeah, there we go.
There we are. Great. And we can start working it through. So who wants to get us started, whether drawing from what you read, or this is, again, a great topic that we all have a pretty decent common knowledge about. And if you don't, tell us that too, and we can puzzle over your lack of Facebook. But does anybody want to get us started to start figuring out, in as lucid and brief a way as we can, starting with Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica thing in particular, what of it touches on the kinds of issues that we've identified here? Anybody want to get us started? Kathy? Yes, we need the throwable box.
So I'll start off with just a tie to what you were talking about with multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. I think there are lots of ways to approach this. One way that I think about a lot, mainly because it's an area I know best, is this idea that the culture really needs to shift. We have a culture where engineers rule. All other disciplines are kind of secondary. Engineers are paid the most. There's like a hierarchy of people, and by default,
Are engineers paid more than venture capitalists?
so in a company, sorry.
Got
So
it.
inside a tech company, usually an engineer, I mean, obviously like an engineer doesn't get paid more than like the VP of legal.
But there was a recent study that showed, this is, I think, Singapore University, that the mean, or the average, I can't remember if it was average or mean, but the pay for engineers had exceeded MBAs, which was kind of, at least in that study, which is kind of interesting, because you think
But if you look at companies like Facebook, there's a hierarchy of people. And that is related to a number of things. It's the fact that companies are like, we need engineers the most, we'll pay you the most, et cetera. And by default, all these other fields, law, philosophy, social science, history, they're not as highly regarded or as valued, and there are people who think deeply about humans and society. We see that weekly there's a Berkman Social Responsibility and Ethical Tech Working Group, and much to the credit of the Berkman Center, we've been able to gather together lawyers, political scientists, historians, what other disciplines, computer scientists, people from industry, people from academia, and those conversations are so enriching because everyone is on the even footing, and I think that's an area that can really help a company like Facebook.
So Kathy, let's take that at face value, which is not hard to do. I remember I interned at Microsoft my junior year of college. I got a telegram from Microsoft inviting me to do so. That somewhat dates me. I was like, I didn't know there still were telegrams. Like, there it was. It said, you may have already won. And I ended up proposing that they should pay for my law school, and afterwards I would come back and be a lawyer for them. And it's like a GI Bill, this would be like a bill. And their answer was, we have two kinds of people at Microsoft, engineers and support staff. And like, if you'd like to continue as an engineer, we'd be thrilled to have you, but otherwise.
There's the eng and non-eng status at a place like Google, right?
Yeah.
You're either eng or not. I don't know if it's like official, it used to be, I don't know. But even if it's not official anymore, it's still like, are you eng or non-eng?
Yeah, certainly you go to the loo and there's like, the bathroom reader is like some problem of the halting variety.
Yes.
Like if you're not an eng, you're like.
Although I do think that, just to jump in a little bit, that depending on the founder of the company, I categorize Silicon Valley companies into three categories: product founder companies, sales founder companies, and engineer founder companies. So Google and Microsoft are engineer founder companies, I think, broadly speaking.
Yeah.
I think like Oracle is a sales founder company, and LinkedIn is a product founder company. And you tend to see a slightly different hierarchy, I think, in the sales and the products.
But now let me just take it one further, because it looks like Sam has already derived from your tale of enjoyment of the BKC working group. All right, encourage more conversations among different disciplines. But we're talking Facebook here. Tell me if there's another solution with that problem in mind of a kind of governance variety. What would we do if we really thought that was a huge source of it? You've got just and only engineers dealing with stuff, and that's a bad way to organize the company. Would you somehow try to have a governance means of reaching in and changing those conversations, or somehow change the incentives of the company that would compel them or impel them to adjust the engineer-centric hierarchy?
I think it takes both, because some governance appeals to some folks, and then governance doesn't appeal to other folks, especially probably the engineering type that's like, whatever governance, I don't care. So I think it takes both approaches, the norms and governance type change, and also reaching in and really thinking about how to embed the culture. So not just pulling in the social scientist at the end of your product and then calling it a day, or pulling in your favorite philosopher at some point, or having a 2-hour law class and saying you're done. really thinking of ways to embed the people on even footing ground, whether it's the way you structure your team, the way managers and leadership talk about the quote support staff, and not calling them support staff. And so I think it takes really every bit of culture change from all levels, and also putting things like governance in place.
So I heard that Alex McGilvory, who's a mutual friend of ours, he's a lawyer, but he got embedded in a product team. And he was the first ever product counsel. That was his name. Instead of having a law desk that you went to and got checked, he was embedded into the design of the product as a lawyer. And now he said he looked on LinkedIn, there are 4,000 of them, I think. And so I think I think one
There's such a thing as catastrophic success.
I know, but I think there's one which is inserting practices into the system. I do have a question broadly, though, whether you can actually change the fundamental hierarchy. So I don't know if this is okay to say. I guess it's okay to say. I mean, I was on the board of Sony, which you may know.
You may have heard of it.
You may have heard of it.
Yeah.
But I bet you couldn't name a single. Well, you probably can't name any Sony executives. But in Japan, what we realized when I looked at it and reflected was there wasn't a single senior executive that anyone knew the name of that was a software person. So that's a hardware company. And we had lots of software, but it was just prioritized because the founding ethos is around stuff, right? And we can spin out things like movies, but then you have to have a culture fork, basically,
yes,
which is what I call it when you spin it out. But it's very difficult when you have sort of this whole chain of founder support. I mean, it's very difficult to change. And I find that companies tend to die and get replaced before they're able to change the fundamental sort of nature of the way management thinks about how they prioritize people who are important, you know, and so so I think there are fixes to try to make things more sensible, and getting dragged in front of Congress is a great way to reprioritize some of these support services in some of these companies. But I think fundamentally there's a kind of DNA when you have an engineer founder company. They tend to try to A/B test their way to solutions. You know, there's certain fundamental sort of DNA that goes in. So I do think that that's a problem. I do think there are some fixes, but it's possible that the real fix is that it has, you know, it doesn't survive. You know.
Well, it also, to me, solutions-wise, gets me thinking of a particular zone of solution that if I had to write a paper for this class, I'd be like, maybe I'll write the paper for this. And I guess I do have to write papers. I'm an academic, so maybe I should write this paper. And it's the idea of, should we actually distinguish in policy between startups and mature companies and have very different regimes for each, and then have to figure out how to draw the line between the two? Certainly in his testimony today, Mark Zuckerberg returned again and again to, we just started off in a dorm room. We didn't really know what we were doing. It's like, you know, it was just two of us in a particle accelerator, and we're really sorry about the incident over Malaysia. Like that might or might not be a good idea for like two people with a particle accelerator. Maybe if you're dangerous enough, you need to, we don't care that you're just a teenager or something. On the other hand, it might be that we think of this kind of innovation economy and a goose laying golden eggs and kind of, wow, let's just get people going, move fast and break things. And at a certain amount of crockery on the floor in shards, as you say, okay, you've moved fast and you've broken things. Now it's time to mature. And there may be a story of that in Microsoft, and their equivalent moment of testimony was the antitrust case, which by one lens was a complete failure. They were found to be a monopolist. They were found to be monopolizing the market in, remember this, browsers and operating systems. And then business as usual ended up largely the result of that multi-year case. On the other hand, I think it did change Microsoft's attitude from the one I described of support staff and engineers to, you're right, we need lobbyists too. And then we should be thinking more cohesively. And you know, Microsoft plays a role, as best I can tell. They have people that really do sit down and worry about legislative fixes to privacy and stuff that of course are in the company's interest, but also have a kind of longitudinal view of the sort that only a company maybe as mature as they are would naturally come to. And there might be ways in the law to try to distinguish between the two. Hallie, I think you were looking like you objected to cutting, oh sorry, Natalie is doing the cues, so.
So a slightly different problem.
Yeah.
I would say that platforms are in a place where they're asking for trust without verification. And what I mean by that is right now, Facebook, Google, Twitter, all the other platforms are asking for our trust in using our data, similar in the way that an AI developer asks for our trust in how they build their particular black box, without necessarily many provisions, and it varies from industry to industry, developer to developer, without any provisions for verification. One concrete example is oftentimes when Facebook comes out with a new product, when they're partnering with publishers, say, they'll say, hey, we have this new product, trust us that our data is correct. And there have been a number of instances where the data has not been.
And the bank error is always in Facebook's favor?
Yes.
Yeah.
And most recently, they only just finished their audit with one of the ad umbrella industries. And that's just relating to publishers, but I think that's illustrative of their relationship to users as well. I think an analogy can be drawn to proprietary AI systems.
And just quickly, solution-wise, let's just run through real quick. What would be means of verification, and how much do they depend on technology versus here's how you would verify any claim made by a company?
Right. So I don't know a particular example, but I do know an analogy. I'd analogize to voting systems where you have, there's a lot of debate over, you have an electronic voting system and you want to have a voter verified paper audit trail. So do whatever you want with your system, but there's some statutory requirement for being able to verify that the result that you're reaching.
Hypothetical statutory requirement.
So, depending on the state that you're in. And so something similar there, a open requirement of some sort for spitting out a verification.
And I think one of the questions that I would have is, it's always kind of easy after the fact to see, oh, we should have been looking at that. And people can criticize, and there's a number of different types of harm, and then ways you would audit it. And there's some hypotheticals, like people criticize Uber by saying they have asymmetric information where they can exploit a bunch of information to arbitrarily increase their revenue versus the fairness. But it's not clear exactly how you would audit it. And then there's other things. Gary and I were in Japan looking at this failure of a cryptocurrency exchange. And here are these guys, having their money, making a market, investing, doing all this stuff that we didn't even imagine that they were doing, so we didn't even know to ask. And I think one of the things that's interesting about emerging business models and this rapid innovation is that I don't think we even know how to ask the question to Uber about what it is that we care about to make it fair. And in Uber's case, it's that there's the drivers and there's the different parties. So the question for me would be, so yes, I think we're trusting them to do the right thing, but they can easily have this kind of how right does it have to be, and what's the trade-off versus money versus what I do, and this gets to ethics too, right? It's like what, and maybe it's if everybody saw what I was doing eventually, will I be embarrassed? Maybe there's a more of a softer test. But I think one of the questions, and gets to your point about the solution, how do you solve for the fact that everybody has a very different configuration, especially in the early years, and we don't really know what we don't know? And how do you ask the question, tell us what we don't know that we should have asked you for?
There's the question right there. It's just, rarely is somebody very forthcoming there when it happens. I would just say your question or observation about trust without verification is an invitation to really start breaking that out, and also to think about the way in which the ecosystem that Facebook is just an example of, they're asking both for second-party trust, which is to say you should trust Facebook when they tell you, for instance, we will never sell your data. And I think as a literal matter, I don't think Facebook sells our data. If they did, they'd be in big trouble because they've said time and again they don't. It's amazing how many people out on the street are like, of course Facebook sells my data. That's what I don't like about them. And then you're like, no, they only target you on the basis of, but that's a kind of second-party trust sort of thing. And then there's third-party trust, which Cambridge Analytica introduces, where somebody does a personality quiz, or remember when you could throw a sheep at somebody? Wasn't that a super poke? And you could throw a sheep. Do you remember that? Good times. that third-party app might ask for a bunch of permissions, and prior to 2015, which is to say the dark ages, yeah, they could just scrape all of your friends' information that would have been exposed to your eyeball if you as a Facebook user had gone in and looked at your friends' stuff that otherwise is non-public, and they got that too, which is how Cambridge Analytica got to 87 million, which is the current highest number. It appears to continue rising. From just the 270,000 that started. And that's a very different form of trust. And it had Facebook in the first instance be like, we are just as outraged as you are, public. And in fact, really, we are the injured party. And we share your outrage. And we have since turned off this person's access to Facebook. He won't be able to do that again. So once again, apologies to the 78 million people whose details were scraped, the end. And that's a very different form of verification that I think even Facebook is not clear how to do without threatening their current business model, and for which I must say, as an academic who worries a lot about generativity and not having lock-ins so that companies can get replaced when their ethoi don't work anymore, it turns out that many of the short-term solutions to privacy, which is like, that's it, no more third-party access. Facebook will be the only place to, query questions, and we'll just run answers for you and use differential privacy to make sure you can't re-identify. That re-centralizes things, even as it's nominally helping privacy.
And I'll just add, just from an economics perspective, and there's some disagreement about this, but highly regulated spaces are difficult for new entrants because there's a huge cost of compliance. In addition to them,
which is another reason why Microsoft is so thrilled at the idea of global privacy regulation.
Right. So you could imagine if Facebook has to spin up a $100 million effort to be able to do this, you're not going to be making another startup Facebook soon. So that there's an interest, like banks often, the cryptocurrency folks often poke at the banks. The banks said, oh, don't regulate us, when in fact those regulations are actually, can be viewed as protection.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts on either of these two opening bids or another bid? I mean, it's such a target-rich environment. We don't want to limit. Oh, yeah, sorry, Hallie.
It's okay, you can come back to me.
No, you've got the box. We don't want to move the box for another 10 minutes.
It's hard because now I'm at what we're talking about now, but my comment was going to be something we said.
That's okay, we've got an outline, it's not a transcript. And you were wincing over the idea of treating the two people in a garage preferentially to Microsoft.
Yeah, I think that what I'm struggling to balance, I think, Joey, you keep coming back to the fact that the more regulation, there is an argument I hear a lot in Silicon Valley, which is, regulation is like the antithesis to innovation, and it's expensive, and it creates these barriers. And I just keep trying to think about solutions that, within a big company, there are launch blockers. Right, so you can't launch a new product if legal hasn't given you the sign-off now. You can't launch a new product if privacy hasn't given you the sign-off. What about if you couldn't launch a new product if the, internal ethics team hadn't given you sign-off and stuff like this? So that would work at a big company. And then I'm trying to think of what that would look like if there was some, calling it again like regulatory agency makes people's eyes glaze over and makes us think about these high barriers to entry and compliance. But is there some way for there to be some general way of thinking about this where smaller companies wouldn't necessarily have to have the in-house ability to do something, but could demonstrate some type of compliance to some standards where I don't get to launch my thing into the universe until I've had certain checks that allow me to feel good myself that I'm doing the right thing and that this won't break, not only that it's on the other side.
So I think there are a number, and we can go into, first of all, I think lawsuits are one way, that if you're big, you're more likely to be sued, and you kind of have to get your act together before you actually have enough harm to worry about it. I'm not against regulations, by the way. And then also there's standards, right? Like IEEE standards, LEED standards. So there's another thing that's interesting about standards, which is they're kind of guidelines that you follow, and you get a check mark if you do it. And if you don't do it, you kind of have to explain why you didn't do it. And I find that standards are actually kind of interesting because they often are more inclusive processes where you, and so we're working right now with the IEEE, and we'll probably make an announcement soon, but the IEEE has a really interesting ethical design of AI. I think they have like 11 standards, and so as an engineer, you kind of have to describe why you're not listening to these things. So I think there are different ways to set up norms for people to follow. So norms are, so getting back to those thinking quadrants, you've got law, norms, market, and code.
That's the biggie.
But and the code, it can be a technical thing, right? So you can imagine an API that requires certain things, or you could require a certain category of differential privacy or zero knowledge proofs in these categories of things, and it could become a technical standard. So I think there are different ways to poke at that.
And the only other thing I wanted to add is there a way to think about now as we see the harms that are caused, you mentioned harms, and I've done a lot of sort of research in this area around thinking about how we might look at it from like a public health standpoint. I think I may have brought this up actually during our autonomous vehicles conversation, but that there are ways, we have frameworks for thinking about this. It feels so new, and it is the Wild West because it is built in a new way. There are not rules that are specifically, have evolved necessarily in this space, but if we see the harm that it's causing en masse, why can't we draw on public health standards and stuff like that?
Well, I will say this a little bit calls back to the brief conversation we had about rules versus standards. How specific should the law be? If it's specific enough, you can even algorithmicize it. Here's your GDPR compliance kit. Answer the following TurboTax style survey, and it will tell you if you're good to go, which can be very nice, versus the mandate of the Federal Trade Commission in the United States is to pursue aggressively against unfair or deceptive trade practices. I don't know what those are. Let's define them. A commission will say. So there would be a neat question about how specific we want to be. And I think in part what you're talking about in the kind of Wild West reference is there may be a whole category of stuff raised by technologies like these that we would describe as lawful but awful. And when they are lawful but awful, that's why having the lawyer team isn't enough, because often the job of the lawyer team is to tell you if you will be sued or arrested. And if the answer is no, thank you. No, I know you have advice, but thank you, lawyers, we're gonna do this. Or the more enlightened lawyer team is, you will be sued or arrested unless you call it this. This is not a direct-to-consumer genetic test. This is an advisory service that involves doing a test here, and boom, now the FDA is happy with 23andMe. So I think if we focus on the category of lawful but awful and the hypothesis that this zone may generate a bunch of such stuff and how do we contend with that? And an external ethics committee or an internal one might be interesting. It does, I think, ask us how much, if we externalize the ethical function, does it, quote, liberate those who aren't on the committee to be like, cool, I'm gonna just figure out how to make a monster out of this, and then you can tell me if my monster is ethically permissible. And I also find myself wondering about, there are so many standards to deploy something that are now a shorthand, very efficient, okay, so we're gonna sell this stuff and there'll be a shopping cart and there'll be checkout. And there are all sorts of ways to do shopping cart and checkout so that your programmers for your new cool pet rock idea don't have to do freaking shopping carts and checkouts all the time. And they're doing a date picker for half of your budget. Is there some way to algorithmicize the technology that examines awful so that people put themselves on notice and others? And that's very different from saying writing an environmental impact statement
aren't
thing. Yeah.
and this came up again in a conversation with AMAC, aren't really good laws that are somewhat timeless in that you can interpret them appropriately for the time? And it feels like what we have right now, so you would disagree with that?
I think the golden rule is timeless.
Yeah.
So that's an example. I think the Sherman Antitrust Act is timeless. I can't believe I just juxtaposed it with the golden rule. But, the Sherman Antitrust Act, combinations and restraint of trade are illegal. Do unto others as you would not monopolize them. And That's great. It's a model of brevity, but it always then requires application and interpretation. And I'm with you in saying the EU regulation of cookies is about 15 years too late.
Yeah, but I guess my point is that I think we end up going into the slope of lawful evil when the things are specific more because it's easier. Like the broader ones.
Good D&D reference.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm into chaotic good.
But you don't say.
but I think I think what might be kind of interesting to think about as we model these layers, because this is sort of our job here, is to integrate this. Is there a layer where you use standard laws to try to direct people to think in a certain way? But that because my concern.
Give me an example.
Give you an example.
Yeah.
We'll talk about this. I think.
No, tell me about a timeless law that would help with the lawful but awful stuff.
So
and maybe with Facebook.
So let me turn it around and
yeah.
say the problem that I have, and we can talk about it a little bit more, is we're fixated on data. We've got this general data protection law, but we're forgetting about the metadata and the model, right? So one of the articles that came out in Tech Review recently is that Cambridge Analytica is likely using the model that it generated from the data in other things, right? So we don't know how to deal with the model because it's not data. And so by specifically using the word data in laws, people who say, oh no, this isn't data, this is just a model that I've trained with the data, but I got rid of the data, so don't worry about me, or the NSA, and this is in a Snowden leaked document that was in last year's syllabus, they're just like throwing the data away and taking the graph data and making a model so they have an opinion about everybody, but I can't explain it. But so I think my concern would be, so the question would be, could we frame the misuse of information about people to create, I mean, there may be, so I feel like the law should be less specific if possible, and to point at a general idea, and then have technical standards and code and other more, it's like a layered approach that's more nimble.
When I, for instance, think about this information fiduciary idea, that's meant to be elegant, if a mouthful, and timeless. And I was trying to boil it down to a New York Times reading audience while cutting the thing in half. It was like...
You're pretty sore about that, aren't you?
No, it's all right. I can still publish the other half. In the Pando Times, as don't screw people over. Like, how about that? And in some ways, unfair or deceptive trade practices, it's just a nice way of saying don't screw people over. And maybe it's true that if somebody takes the data, puts it into a model, which totally defines how the model will work, then throws away the data, it's a bit of a dodge to be like, no, the data's gone. It's like, there's no foot here, there's only a footprint.
Yeah.
Well, okay, that's a footprint.
But the paper that we read about the FICO scores, where they're targeting the household because it's not personally identified. This is kind of these, again, by using specific words,
yes.
You give the opportunity.
It certainly does suggest that on a general rubric of don't screw people over or be loyal to them, AKA fiduciaries, that will evolve as the tools by which to screw them over evolve, and the tools by which to maybe vindicate their interests evolve. And I agree that the data model distinction you're drawing is a great example of how the focus on personally identifiable information, PII, in 2018 seems awfully narrow. When a model trained on all of you, but I, being a hermit, refuse to disclose any data, but then I apply for something and I have to disclose some data for that, and they use everything they learned from you to make a judgment about me that may contain bias. There's not a PII issue either for you or for me, but there is an issue that may get to the 8 kinds of philosophical fairness that you're talking about. There are other people who've been wanting to get in, and probably the...
Does Gary have the mic?
Or somebody has it. No, it's okay. Whoever has it, please, go.
So this isn't relevant to what we were talking about right now, but another problem in this area, I think, is it pertains to Facebook, but also more generally to other social media platforms, is I think the excessive focus on engagement metrics and the way content is algorithmically ranked in our news feeds and results pages to be one that users will most interact with.
Yes.
Rather than what is obviously accurate. So this also correlates with the more engaging a piece of content is, might also be content that also correlates with misinformation.
Yeah, you start with Hillary Clinton video or even a Donald Trump video, and before you know it, they all lead to Alex Jones on YouTube. There's some paper about that, right? I think. Maybe I'm misinforming. But there's some paper about how YouTube in particular, no matter what you do, you end up with Alex Jones. I don't know if you start with Alex Jones where you go. But I think that's an illustration maybe of your point, and if engagement is the only thing. And that poses, I think, a question for information fiduciary, because if you're supposed to be loyal to the user, you're saying, I am loyal to the user. Look how much the user is spending time on the site. In fact, I can show you that if we were showing them anything other than these weird videos about the protocols of the elders, they would be off on another site.
Yeah. I think Tristan Harris talks a lot about that.
Yes,
yeah.
And to me, it has meant in fiduciary theory to say that we should be looking after second order rather than first order preferences, something I know we talked about in an earlier class. That's my way of getting around the problem you're describing without abandoning a user loyalty paradigm in favor of a public health one. The public health and society is threatened if they look at too much Alex Jones, so we just won't show it to them. I get nervous going that way because I get nervous as to who gets to determine what the public health is, but still want to see an understanding of loyalty to the user that isn't, I have them drooling at their keyboard because they've been there for 6 hours because Peppa Pig keeps showing up.
How do you embed this loyalty to the user within the algorithm that's meant to show you in ranked order, this is what you should be viewing on a newsfeed? I think what platforms are doing right now is encouraging fact-checking and user reporting after something has already been posted.
Yes.
But if there are like some metrics of incorporating things like verification, accuracy, or quality in the ranking system itself to give greater exposure or preference to things that have been shown to be verified, instead of verifying after something that's most engaging has been already posted.
Presuming that verification rather than engagement is the name of the game, which I think you're saying it is. Engagement with falsehoods is less than less engagement with truths.
And
is that,
just
is that right?
as to refer to the work in our laboratory for social machines that was in Science recently, they go back 12 years in Twitter data, and they basically show that stories, and they looked at, I think, 4 or 5 of the fact-checking sites like Snopes, and what they did was they looked at all of the articles and how they were shared, and they have a fundamentally different profile, and basically false information propagates faster, and it's the humans that do it. So there's, the good news is you can tell before other people can tell.
I love how it took all this work to affirm what like Mark Twain casually said in the late 19th century, was that the falsehood is around the block while the truth is still tying its shoes.
The neat thing though, and we don't know what the tool is yet, but actually you can, at a fairly high accuracy, predict if something is false by the way that it starts to spread. So that could possibly be a way to say, oh wait, this is spreading like false news, let's take a look at it. So there's some interesting signal there, but it is kind of a slippery slope because it does start to get into First Amendment rights. It starts to get into who's, because everything there starts to be these gray zones, right? It's not black and white. So,
and would you want to see a regulatory intrusion, to use a loaded word, into whether engagement is permitted as the primary driver for profit? Or would it be somehow, no, the companies should just be ethical. They should have their own sense of what's good and what's bad.
I think that the algorithm should just consider other factors.
Which is to say the people who write those algorithms should consider other factors. Should they just be told, you all should consider other factors, or should they be required to consider other factors? Say again?
required.
Required. Yeah. Got it. Where has the box found
Over
a new
here.
home?
I've got it.
The regulator.
This is the economics multidisciplinary, coupled with public policy, if you want. I think the economics, back to the problem side for Sam, because these are solutions. The problem is basically an age-old economic issue of network effects. And I don't know that our public policy has really kept up with it. In essence, that when certain businesses get to be at a place in our economy where the sort of classic rules of microeconomics don't work, railroads in the late 19th century, electric utilities in the early 20th century, even in some cases big banks and so forth. But Facebook, people want to engage, and I'm not a member of Facebook, so I don't, but I suspect that everybody else in the room has probably got a Facebook account.
I got to say, I love the use of, like, I'm a member of, like, membership has its privileges. I'm willing to recommend you if you'd like to join.
Yeah, oh, thank you, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, and I can recommend.
The proper vernacular is, I am not a member of the Facebook community
Oh, no.
of 2.2 billion people.
2.2, but I'm not one of those 2.2 billion.
Yes.
But
There is
I
a
think
shadow
that-
profile waiting for you to claim.
But I think that this is the classic problem of network effects, that Facebook and many other of the platforms have such ability to collect economic rents. I don't think setting up an ethics department is going to necessarily do it. And I know Joey said he's not a fan of more regulation, but I think at some level it's not about regulation.
I heard him say he's not a fan,
Yeah.
which is a very weaselly
I
thing
think he's
to
been
say.
on both sides of it, actually.
He's seen me in action. That's the problem.
I see.
Yeah.
It's revealed preference versus stated preference.
But I think that if the core issue is privacy, if the core issue is providing platforms for no subscription charge, so they're trying to earn advertising dollars, they're trying to earn advertising dollars by commercializing and monetizing our data. They say they don't sell our data, but they are certainly monetizing our data. Then there is a role for government to step in and said, you can't tie the use of your platform to selling this data or monetizing the data the way. So the Europeans have gone further than the Americans, but it's worth a lively debate as to how to use data and how to tie that data together. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a space. It might be a new Sherman Antitrust Act. I don't know, but for
well, the old one certainly contemplates network effects.
It does need to be
contemplates network
reset.
effects, but not in the area of the modern digital age.
Yeah. You were going to say something?
No, I was saying that there's a guy that is really doing amazing work trying to revamp antitrust and use, because it's not being that effective these days. And I think that's actually a really interesting line of inquiry to go after some of the
For
problems.
what it's worth, for my part, I find myself really re-interested in antitrust, or competition as we call it in Europe, less in defining when there's a problem that calls for intervention, because the normal whiskers that get tickled for antitrust often aren't for these things, even with the network effects you describe, but to look in the toolbox for remedies that has to do potentially with breakups, with splitting. It was really interesting. There was a moment of thinking about remedies in the Microsoft case where there was a lot of creativity. There was one idea of taking the source code to Windows, forking it 6 times, and having what they would call the baby bills instead of the baby bells. And there would be 6 new Microsofts, kind of like parallel universes, with 6 new CEOs. One of them could be Bill, and 6 staffs. And then at t=0, you could install any of them and run any Microsoft software. And then as time went on, they would each develop in different directions. The monopoly would be broken, and it would be like hellacious to figure out, like, you know, get this new first-person shooter game. It runs on 3 of the 4 Microsoft platforms, and we haven't tested the other 2 yet. Yes.
So I have a citation. So this guy's name is Barry Lin, and definitely worth looking up. So basically, he argues that somewhere along the way, and I can't remember, there's a point where they shift antitrust away from its original purpose towards sort of consumer efficiency and cost. And by going back and taking what the original idea, I think, which is the concentration of power in and of itself being the issue.
I don't know the name. You may be thinking of the Chicago School and its influence.
Right, but he's fighting against that. And
Yes.
so this guy actually was notoriously and allegedly fired from the New America Foundation for his views on
Oh, that
antitrust.
guy. I thought you were talking about like some 1930s.
No.
dude. Yeah.
He's like a hard.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, he's to me on my list of disobedience prize winner guys. I mean, he's actually trying to go after
Highly secretive process by which
these-
nominees are considered.
anyone can nominate.
Yes.
But I think thinking about reviving this gets back to my point about timeless laws.
Yes.
A lot of the laws have been disabled.
Yes.
By various political processes, and so
Yes.
part of your spelunking
Yes.
might be to go look for things like antitrust and other
Yes.
things that may be reapplied in this context that we haven't been able to use.
But also notice that the kinds of solutions I was just mentioning and that you were talking about, Joey, in rediscovering the core of antitrust, is if you think the problem of a lack of competition should be solved with more competition. When you've identified privacy as the problem, competition may further complicate things while solving other issues, which is why maybe some of your answer was tilting towards regulation, an invitation to a regulated monopoly that would trust information the way that we would expect the phone companies to treat surveillance of conversations with a highly complex, whether satisfying or not, statutory scheme as to when the government can listen in.
Or simply saying that you can't tie your entire data set
Yeah.
to one unit, so that if you sign a user agreement, it says you can scrape all my information and use it as you wish.
Yeah.
And
So it's like an on-off switch.
Yeah, yeah.
Or you can scrape everything.
Yeah.
somebody will have to remember who said this, but you know who it was? It was I think it was in a conversation with Julia Angwin, but was that this binary thing of opting in or out is not the same as the ability to negotiate. And I think the problem is you don't want to say, oh, well, you can either participate in society or not. It's your choice, right? It's actually, we are unable to negotiate. So another intervention, I think, and this could be a fiduciary or it could be a class of people who negotiate with somebody about a clause, right? Because I think that's the problem with these click-through terms of service, is that you really don't have, being able to opt out isn't really what you want. You want the ability to negotiate with.
Maybe,
right?
and I'm glad that you anticipated my objection, which was also in the article, which is like, oh God, Facebook's about to ask me for something. It's like, do you accept or would you care to negotiate? Like, can I have my bot negotiate for me? Which bot would you like to negotiate for you? The good one. Like the one that doesn't screw me over. And of course, what Joey was already, I think, anticipating with that objection and then suggesting was, like, we will all just appoint Ralph Nader and like maybe 2 other people to negotiate on our behalf. And if Ralph says it's okay, then maybe it's all
so
right.
it's a class, right.
But something that doesn't require of us the totally enervating overhead of having to refine a bunch of preferences if it isn't all or nothing, when we're just trying to throw a sheep at somebody. Like, I don't know, do they want my bank account info? That sounds bad, but do you need to know? Especially when it later could have great impact. It didn't seem that big a deal to say what your last 10 check-ins were, but Joey just trained a new model that now predicts your political vote on the basis of
And this is a key part in Balkan's paper on information fiduciaries, which is you need somebody that is actually a fiduciary and doesn't introduce all these conflicts, right? Because the last thing you want, and this happens a lot in Japan, which is you get these consortiums that speak on behalf of somebody, but then they get captured. And actually, there are people seconded from the companies regulating the companies, and it just turns into a sort of a theater of
In the American
negotiation.
example, and in the privacy example, Trustee, T-R-U-S-T-E, originally .org, now .com, now with more profit, is a good example of that. That started out as an organization that was going to do a good housekeeping seal of approval on websites that respected privacy. They have a dispute resolution system, so if somebody joins Trustee, then they have to, kind of like the Better Business Bureau, abide by a dispute resolution. I think they still exist. If you were to alt-tab over, you'd probably find them. And I just to test it out, when a website screwed me over in some typical and minor way, I was like, all right, I'll fill out the form. It's research. And Trustee completely had no interest in resolving the problem, in part because their members are the companies, of course, not the people. The last real quick piece on that, though, I want to harken back to Coachella weekend, where to me at least, I worry that privacy is the wrong label. It already has a meaning that feels kind of starched and paranoid. It's immediately about data rather than models, say. It got PII. It carries a lot of baggage, which can be convenient if the baggage is where you want to direct somebody. But for these things, I think they're so new. I tend to go back to autonomy, about this feeling of pervasive, how did I put it in the opening thing? A vague sense of unease and helplessness about the way in which we expose ourselves to the world by simply using these services, so we can put a picture of our kid here and figure out if there's an event next week we want to attend. I mean, stuff that just feels like decent, and have no idea the machinery underneath that may be judging us, importuning us. And it's early, as I was saying, that like to think that psychometric profiling is so great that, you know, we've lost all control. But as the singularitarians and the effective altruists tend to say, like, just wait. Like, you know, eventually it'll get pretty good, and we don't get better. We stay as us. And thinking about how to vindicate our sense of, and in fact our real autonomy, if indeed we have it to begin with, that feels to me the right level of question to be asking rather than one of privacy. Lots of other hands up. I don't know where the box is. Natalie, yep.
Thank you. Hey guys, so just a quick response to the first point around like interdisciplinary kind of thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot from the perspective of, I mean, I have a consulting business, and so I think about this like going in and working with organizations, you know, and one of the things that we try doing is getting multidisciplinary teams to like try on the mindsets of different types of disciplines. So it's not just enough to have people in a room together who come from different backgrounds, but like are there seminal parts of those backgrounds that can be shared in an experiential kind of context? I have no idea what that implies for governance, but you know, like for team performance, at least in our experience, it seems to be working. And we're actually working on a book on that called Macaronic, and so stay tuned. But then the other thing that I wanted to mention, or actually put out there as a question, is about like your thoughts on consultative regulation and what it might look like in some of these contexts when we're talking about data, but also then what can be extrapolated from data, these lawful but awful kinds of cases. I'm reminded of mobile money in East Africa, so forgive me just a little bit of background here, but like there are these cell phone, there's this predominant model that's come primarily from East Africa around cell phone companies offering data plans and then also mobile money. And so like an electronic wallet where you can store money in your prepaid phone account and then send it around like Venmo or PayPal or what have you. And when the like preeminent model of this was coming online, this is Safaricom in Kenya, you know, like Safaricom went to the Central Bank of Kenya and their payments team there, and they actually obtained a consent decree, and you know, so they established like a working relationship where the central bank was monitoring what they were doing in order to make sure the rollout of this mobile money platform was effective. And it went from like no coverage in 2007 to around like 70-something% of the adult population had accounts there, you know, in 2010. So it was a huge change, right? In that case, this model of consultative regulation worked to create this kind of enabling environment that started out with one player and now it's a fairly competitive space, you know. I wonder what that would look like in some of these applications that we're talking about. I have no idea. And so
Can I poke on the Safaricom thing though? Because when I was there, and it may have been just one view, but Safaricom was the local telco, so they had a lot of heft, so they could go in, they were regulated anyway, they were buddies with the central bank. But my understanding was that they suppressed competition and innovation tremendously at the beginning and had fairly high rents that they took for a fairly long period of time. And so if I were thinking lawful evil here, I would say, well, as a telco deploying a payment system, sure, I'm going to go in with a regulator and try to block the little guys. Is that a distorted view?
There are a couple quick points. I mean, so Safaricom it's the local subsidiary of Vodafone, so like it's this huge multinational corporation. There's like, I think, you know, a large minority stake of the company is owned by the the Kenyan government. So there are a couple of things there. But since then, the regulator has imposed interoperability rules and so on, so that you can move money from one platform to another, kind of like how you can access your Chase account at a Bank of America ATM, those kinds of interoperability rules and so on. And I'd also say that the starting position is different because it's, hey, look, they're concerned about the money supply and they don't want, inflation and so on. So there's a different regulatory onus there that I don't know if that translates well to the context that we're talking about. And that's partly why I put it out there,
Good.
So you were talking about autonomy, can the problem also be framed around ownership, where it's required that the users, when their data is used, it doesn't mean that now the company owns the data that is labored upon, and the users can actually, there's a protocol to move the data around, like in emails, where my emails can be forwarded to different servers and different service providers. So if I don't like a service, I can actually add another layer of interface through which I interact with the information. And this way, at least there's a chance to say, okay, if I don't like Facebook, I can actually collectively move all of my data and then now go about my social media with another provider.
Yeah, it's a nice callback to the earlier session in which we talked for a bit about the trickiness of the word ownership. It has its own baggage with it, and is maybe best immediately broken down into, as awkward as it sounds to say it, what are the affordances around this data? And if I want to use it for one purpose, to facilitate a transaction, to let somebody do something with me, I don't want to give more than I need. And maybe after that use has been consummated, I want it to be forgotten. And there could be ways through technology, at the risk of sounding like a solutionist, how dare I, to think about technologies that might have applied, this is part of the article that was cut, to digital rights management back in the aughts, because you could not trust, you had to verify that teenagers were not copying music that was only supposed to be for their ears, and then before you know it, they've given it to a billion of their closest friends. Couldn't those DRM technologies be applied to privacy and to be able to have an innate verification built in so that I can see it's 10 o'clock, where's my data been, and I'd like to pull it back from here and there. You could write that layer. It doesn't exist right now, but you could write it. You could write it virtually at first and then maybe embed it and have companies have to be a party to it and swear by it. And that might be a way, when you talk about substituting one layer for another, of trying to make it accessible to everyone and as natural as kind of breathing online to do it. And I wouldn't want to call it ownership. I'd want to call it something about, I don't know, is it data management? Is it data auditing?
But I think you still need somebody that, like a fiduciary, because if you pivot away from Facebook for a second and remember some of the stuff in algorithmic bias, right? So child welfare, they harvest all of the data that poor people create because they're using public services, whereas the rich people who go to Betty Ford and go to their private shrinks have no data. And so in a way, if you kind of give this system where you can negotiate for your rights and kind of clean it up for certain services, it might turn into a rich people's solution. And the poor people who can't negotiate because they need the free services or they need to give up their privacy in order to get the thing to survive, you could see this income disparity playing out. And I think what you'd want to, and this is where I would call for some sort of regulator or a fiduciary to make sure that an implementation like that for a certain set of services that comply, but then again, this is the idea of selling your data for services where it's kind of like selling your organs you can't do even if you need the money.
Yeah. Well, it's also a reminder of the public-private divide. By anchoring our conversation today as a starting point with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, we're a few clicks away from thinking about government use and abuse and all of those issues that came up, of course, most prominently in the risk score and bail and justice context. But even in Facebook Cambridge Analytica, there's the neat question of should the government on equal terms be able to buy whatever any other private party could buy, or is that something that's a step too far? But I agree with you that this also gets to the neat question asked earlier in the term about the difference between justice and fairness, which to a standard lawyer's ears are like, I don't know, I kind of want them both. More as in this emerging field, there really are a term of art definition shaping up between those two. And Joey kind of interestingly made the move about, I don't want justice if it's not fair, because it might leave, say, the poor behind. We've got to keep the fairness in line with the justice.
Also, just another quick idea is you were like talking about, okay, how do we allow users to sort of negotiate for certain things collectively? Like, how could we frame the problem along the lines of like labor unions where we are actually laboring on Facebook? Like we make Facebook make money in some way. Like, are there parallels that can be thought of in terms of, okay, we are, even though we are benefiting from the system, there is an exchange going on. We go in, like we do things, we actively do something and Facebook makes money out of it. So now we deserve to build unions within that community. Would that be a possibility?
Did you say unions?
Labor, yeah, labor unions.
Labor unions.
But I think you have to remember what Alex said when he Skyped in was be careful what you wish for, because 2 billion people, most of them probably don't have the same values that you do. And so if we voted on Facebook today whether there should be free speech, it'd be an interesting question, right? So I think that, you know, thinking about 2 billion people as a single community with a single point of view is kind of interesting.
He did say unions plural, but there is a question of
there's
how
a question, yeah, but there are probably
federate
some, so that'd be interesting to see what can be compartmentalized and can't.
Well, it's also interesting. It may seem, for example, that my view that was kind of, Mark Zuckerberg, you can still fix this. Like here, you should, you know, pull out the stops when you talk tomorrow, versus Zeynep or Tim Wu. Tim Wu is being like, it's time to blow up Facebook. And Zeynep is like, the problem is the ecosystem. There's nothing that Mark can or can't do to change it. Your example of, say, be careful what you ask for on governance is a neat reminder that over the years, and as best I can tell at a distance, against all counsel, Mark Zuckerberg has had some minor obsession with thinking of Facebook as a country, its users as citizens. I guess that makes him the platonic dictator, benevolent, and wanting to create a community governance mechanism, which in 2009, I want to say, do people remember 2009? There was a moment where Facebook said that any big changes to its policies would be put before the users as a polity, and then they would vote on them. Do people remember this? Mm-hmm. It was weird. And I remember at the time thinking, that's weird. But it was ambitious in a way that made no economic or even public relations sense. They didn't get a quorum for the vote, and then they quietly got rid of the whole thing. I think Mark wants to bring it back, and he also just mentioned to Ezra Klein the idea of like, there should be a Facebook Supreme Court to decide these things. And that's not of us. There'd be distinguished jurists who would become Facebook jurists who would weigh in on free speech questions. I feel like he does have these ambitions of forms of accountability that only he, paradoxically, as the 60% governance vote holder, while only a 16% shareholder, could just implement by fiat and against the advice of everybody else. He's intrigued by that kind of stuff. Sorry, Joey.
I'm just going to say, and I don't think this is confidential, and I don't remember precisely, so it's probably fine. But I think there's I think 3 things that they measure. And engagement's one of them, but I think it's some proxy for happiness. I mean, I think that they really do care whether their users feel happy. You know, I mean, I think so I think the point is that it's quite sincere, I think, and they've always designed the system not just for pure addictive engagement, but to try to make the communities feel happy. And so
I at least find it to be helpful sometimes to take them at their word publicly for the purpose of holding them to the values they were at least hypocritically and possibly sincerely willing to espouse. That's at least, and that I think makes my approach perfectly commensurable with Zeynep's and Tim's, It's just a bit of a pincer movement.
Yeah.
Sorry,
No,
a
go.
three-way pincer movement. A three-dimensional pincer movement?
I wanted to loop back to a strand that's come up in a few things. Hallie started with one thought about treating some of these questions as public health issues. And I think that that's worth really taking seriously, because what I've been thinking a lot about is how all these things were like, oh, we'll put ethics people into, maybe they all have to have philosophers, like job program for philosophers. Every company has to have one. None of these things are really going to get a grip if we don't take a look at what the incentives are. And I think that's why it's smart to talk about things like regulation and antitrust things and stuff like that. But there are real issues about these business models. I mean, an attention harvesting business model looks to me like a public health issue. I think that we need to really think, and so I think attacking these things at that level is going to end up being important. And so then I think we
In the
need to
sense that
like-
you'd say gambling is a public health issue.
Yeah.
And cigarette smoking is a public health issue.
Yeah, exactly. It's like cigarettes or gambling or those
Yeah,
things.
it's
that we,
addiction.
Yeah.
Or dependence. Yeah.
Exactly. And then when we're trying to think about, some of the like kind of privacy things, we say to ourselves, well, if we really think that like the abuse of data is a scourge of that kind, then maybe it's not about tweaking what the dialogue boxes are and stuff. It's like, no, what we do is we ban personalized advertising.
Yeah.
You can't market to people at a granular level like that.
But how does that, is that because it's not just addictive, the engagement piece that was already raised, but you're saying the advertising could be so good, people will buy too much stuff that they don't need? Is that
No,
the
I'm saying
reason?
as a separate problem, the incentives for keeping and harvesting this data. So separate from the attention harvesting, that's one issue. Another one is the fact that these companies are collecting and sharing and monetizing the data. We make that harder so that there's not an incentive.
But would you be okay with like just-in-time personalized advertising rather than based on some toxic waste
I don't think
barrel
so.
of-
I don't think that there's any benefit to consumers from this whole ecosystem. And I used to work in advertising, but I do not think that this is good for us.
Follow this out for just a moment, because I want to understand if it's still on this addiction criterion or something else.
I'm talking about two separate questions.
I mean, I turned off my Google ad choice thing, and now when I look at the New York Times, oddly I pay but still see ads. The best of both worlds, really. The only ads I ever see are for Harry's razors. And I realize that even if I finally cave in and like, fine, I'll buy the fricking razors, I will still see the ads because my ad choice preference is off. Am I better off than if I saw an ad for exactly the thing I need next weekend? It's like, oh, it turns out I'm going to the Bahamas. I could use a snorkel outfit. Like, why am I being harmed by that? What's the problem with targeted advertising?
Well, so the proposal was whether or not, I mean, I actually think that there are arguments that could be made about that being a harm, but I don't think I need to make that argument for the proposal to make sense. So the issue is that the extreme emphasis on targeting is part of a business model that encourages collection,
Yeah, that's why I asked about
retention,
just in time.
and
Because so you're saying the
dissemination.
targeted ads are not bad unto themselves. They just tend to produce practices that have collateral damage.
But I think you can argue that for certain populations, certain targeted ads are bad.
Payday
Yeah, I do
loan.
think you can make that argument, but I was
Yeah.
actually trying to make the somewhat more modest argument about just like,
Uh-huh.
say you were neutral about whether targeted ads are bad in and of themselves. You could still think that they clearly foster these practices that are very harmful, so that there should be, real thoughts about how to adjust the business model in that domain.
Got it.
So this is kind of pretty underdeveloped thought, but I was chiming into the testimony that Mark Zuckerberg was doing a couple minutes before class started, and one thing that I observed and was quite interesting on the topic of multi/anti-disciplinary studies is that there was a huge gap between sort of the lawmakers and sort of the things that Mark Zuckerberg knew and was sort of expressing, and oftentimes it felt like that lack of literacy resulted in an inability to sort of push back on a lot of the comments that Mark Zuckerberg was making, or sort of the evasive comments or lack of sort of incentive to actually express the truths.
Somebody observed there was like a key moment where Mark realized, oh, this is going to be easy.
Exactly.
And like Orrin Hatch was like, I don't understand. If it's free, how do you make money?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And it got to a point where some of these questions were quite trivial in nature. And I think the issue with what we saw was that they weren't even in a position to be able to ask the right questions.
So shouldn't they have like a special panel that like Senator Schatz can just be like, I yield the balance of my time to Ed Felton. Like, Ed, take it away. Like, is that where you're going?
And that's sort of an interesting perspective, because previously we talked about how, we need these engineering teams to be diversified with more ethics professionals or philosophy individuals. But it's also interesting to think from a governance point of view when talking about lawmakers, how there's also a lack of literacy in some of these topics where tech is becoming more complex.
And that's similar to the opposite of the power dynamic, where in Silicon Valley engineers rule, whereas in Washington the economists and the lawyers rule. And when you see the people who are in the front rows,
the septuagenarians rule, which not to. That is not itself
but
a problem.
I mean, I'm curious. I mean, I think this is a really important point. And when I was talking at the law school, my argument was that it was just as important to get the lawyers technically capable as it is to get the technical people ethically and legally capable. And I think this is exactly the point, because you don't know what questions to ask. Or the flip side, I remember Lindsey Graham, when I was arguing with him, he was like shaking his finger at me saying, the lawless days of the internet are over, we're gonna shut you down. I'm like, good luck, and
when was that?
It'll date me. But
the funny thing is, it could have been last week.
No, but like he had never used the internet before, and he was in charge of the committee who was making all these decisions about internet and copyright. And so I mean, it's like in certain fields where the worlds come together, where you have an economist from Goldman Sachs person going after that field, it functions like the CFTC. But I think right now, where we have these engineers coming together with these lawyers, it's pretty dysfunctional. What do you do? You're in charge of pumping those people out of Harvard.
To the spectacle of a hearing, there are some hearings that have a forensic purpose, that are really for the purpose of figuring out, putting somebody under oath and asking them in a public venue or a private one, and then you have a transcript later, tough questions. Iran-Contra. I remember watching those hearings and being like, wow. And the members of Congress actually turned over most of the questioning to counsel, who were not elected people. It's like John Nields or Arthur Lyman would just ask question after question. They were good. I was like, God, I wonder how they're gonna answer that one, which is different from like Orrin Hatch just threw a zinger over first base there. The home plate is that way. And you could see doing something there, right? Wouldn't it be fun to just be like, Kathy O'Neill has a few questions she'd like to ask. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And then you could even see aligning it with the incentives of the senators to be like, all right, this was a hearing that really.
But wasn't there a thread on the Berkman list of
questions that should be asked?
Yeah. And so.
And those members do reach out for questions. It's just sometimes it's really hard to, in one question, drop the bomb. It's kind of a bit of a house that you build, and it's harder. I mean, I've seen it from multiple sides where the member of Congress reads the question, and it's so clear, like they literally do not know the lines they're reading, but it's okay, the question's getting asked, and then somebody just says, well, it's very complicated, and they're like, okay, next question. So in a hearing context, that may be solvable through delegation. In a lawmaking context, there are some ways many ways to invoke expertise. You just have to have the incentives and what the lawyers would call the public choice problems and incentives aligned so that you're in a fact-based policy environment rather than only what you'd call a stakeholder-based one. Mm-hmm. And that gets also back to the consultative regulation, where having the stakeholders in is quite good, but also having people who literally are not the stakeholders in is really important.
And I think that's a great idea, because one thing that sort of concerned me was the clumsiness of these questions, because as you mentioned, there was a clear lack in understanding of what some of these key concepts, servers or data or storage, or just very trivial things were.
Yes.
And in thinking about the policy or law aspect if similar instances were occurring. But I think
This calls for a joint master's program with people who can.
I think another question that I had was, we've talked about transparency before, and in this case, we're looking at these two parties where you have the lawmakers and the engineers, but there was a point where one of the senators pulled out, I think it was the terms of use or the terms of service, and it was just this thick thing where he cited how one portion had X thousand words with X hundred links to other pages that had X thousand words with a subset of links.
Yeah.
And so as a user or as a customer, how do you digest these things? Yes, it's transparent.
Answer, fiduciary. You don't have to read it because it's not going to screw you over. That would be my answer and Jack Balkin's answer, but in choice context, I guess it's about simplification.
You're always an expert facing a panel of generalists. And so just in fairness, even if they're bright people, they're not also bright. But I mean, even if they're really bright, really knowledgeable, they're generalists. So often their second question can't stay with you. So answer the first question, take a little bit about what they asked, make sure you repeat at least 1 to 3 words that were in their question, and about 10 to 15 words in, then pivot to something that's a home base that's safe for you. So you appear respectful in the first 15 words that you're answering the question. Pivot to a home base, and only 10% of the time will the second question be something that's tough. You're generous. You're the expert.
Now you know how to do it. Use your powers wisely.
And just a side benefit of the lens.
Yes.
So it strikes me that a lot of the conversation we've been having around Cambridge Analytica, predictive analytics, targeted ads, et cetera, is very much about persuasion. This idea that if you have my data, you have some kind of informational portrait of me, and then you can use it to predict, some menu of choices, a choice architecture for me, and then I'll make those choices based on what you've decided I am as a person, right? And this offends us precisely because it offends the autonomous side of us, which is supposed to be this rational,
Yes.
Independent actor, right?
Seems unsporting. Yes.
Right. But this sort of rational, individual, independent actor idea, is it has a very specific history from the Enlightenment. We have this portrait in our mind of ourselves, of who we are, and I think the reason why all of this is so, makes us so uneasy is that I think the data is showing us that perhaps we're not individuals, right? And this is where Pentland's work is really important for me. He shows this. He says that, if you look at hordes and hordes of people, they tend to make decisions just like each other, which is why we can have something like computational social science. And this sort of brings me back to a more original idea by Herbert Simon, who compared human beings to ants, essentially. And he said that, whatever happens in the cortices of their brains is not that important. It's really just the environment that shapes them. So if you, change around a few twigs in ants' atmosphere, it'll travel in a different way. And I think that we can use that metaphor in this today by thinking of the environment as sort of an informational environment, right? That we have this sort of strange, ubiquitous situation where all of this data is being collected about us, and not just while we're on the web, but in our homes, et cetera, using all these devices. And there's all of these optimizations that are constantly going on, and we don't have control over, the system has this Markovian foresight, and it might optimize me to land up to some kind of X decision based on whatever it thought might be good for me. And I think the problem is that it highlights this issue between individuality and autonomy. And so maybe we need to give up a little bit of our individuality to be more autonomous if we can pre-specify what it is that we're aiming for. And I think that's the problem. We don't really know what we're optimizing for.
If I'm understanding you right, and I might not be, you're pointing out a really interesting puzzle for people like me who are like, autonomy, that's what we want, where I'm describing autonomy as so important and so core to us, and yet so malleable that a few twigs could have me be like, chocolate ice cream, that's what I'm all about. Wait a minute, you told me later that it was the twigs that made me want the ice cream? In fact, untwigged, I would want a cigar? Like, my autonomy is, like, that is a weird thing for me to have to work through. And it sounds like your way of working it through is to say, the twigs rule, deal with it. Try to somehow untwiggedly say where you'd like to be,
Right.
and then let the twigs take you there.
Right.
This is a really weird extended metaphor on my part. But
No, I think that's quite right. And I think along the way, maybe have some tools for visualization. So
Yes.
if we do live in this crazy, complex, dynamical system where all of these things are
Yes.
happening, what's a way, if I know that maybe these twigs are good for me, I can go with it.
Yes.
But if I can sort of see what's happening, then maybe at some point I can be like, no, I don't really like where that's going, and I can opt out.
that's certainly my vision somewhat of second order preferences, and then allowing a Facebook or somebody as your fiduciary to help guide you there. It's why maybe I'm not going to meditate the way Joey does, but the Headspace app will tell me to do it when I'm supposed to.
And this actually, I think, is the risk of a certain category of fiduciary where we've had this conversation at the Media Lab with faculty, and we get divided about 50-50. So the question being, should you be allowed to be deceptive for the benefit of the deceive, right? So
the question of placebo.
Yeah, so placebo or overstating a risk in order to get people to comply with drugs. And so this is somebody, your fiduciary, determining that it's better for you if you are living longer, and deciding your second order wants maybe based on a religion, maybe based on some sacred set of norms that they're adhering to, or a Hippocratic oath that death is the worst possible thing. It's okay if you suffer and live longer.
I think you read
right?
a bad version of the Hippocratic Oath.
Yeah. No, but for example, right now you find in practice medical doctors really counting death as a black mark. So they will drag you into a very painful procedure often in order to prevent or in long
I do think it's time for you to change HMOs.
Yeah. No, but no, this is a known bug, which is that they score their success on whether no one dies on their watch, where it's not as much about
the ultimate engagement.
But my point being, I think there's the third order want, which is, how much agency do you want in setting the second order want, or do you say, I'm part of this community, I would let the norms of the community
I'll have
dictate.
what they're having. I don't even need to look at it.
Yeah, something like that.
For a last question before we bring it in for a landing.
Yeah, so to address the first point, I mean, it's a fair point, but it also feels a little bit self-righteous for us to say that, sitting up here in our semi-literal ivory tower of a classroom, and to say, like, all of tech culture is just evil that way. And I think there's nothing inherent to engineering or CS that should make it that way. And I also think that making that more balanced, let's say everyone had, like, equal priority in decision-making and everyone were speaking the same language, having been well-trained in multidisciplinary thinking, even if we had that, we'd still need fiduciaries or something, because the incentives would still be skewed. One of the biggest problems here is that companies are going to try and get away with as much as they can. We should pretty much assume they will, and we've talked about companies in this class that do that. And given that, we do need some kind of external imposition of some rules. And it's my instinct that it's going to have to be something technical. As these fields mature, there are going to be more technical guarantees, and I think some of those will have to be externally imposed. So these would be things like differential privacy guarantees or like zero-knowledge proof type things that were implemented in practice. And I think they really will have to be externally imposed for the incentives to work out, so that's why fiduciaries are a good idea. But I also think that, you want the companies to do the work in terms of that. If the regulators have to say this is the rule, but they're the ones who have to check everything, stuff is going to fall through the cracks. And to avoid that, I think you need to put some of that burden on companies and say, prove this before you release this product. Maybe that's going to be a spectrum. Maybe you're going to handle mature companies differently. But I feel pretty strongly that just getting everyone on the same page won't solve the problem, and we're going to have to split up the incentives somehow to actually protect users.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and one of the readings that I wrote that we popped on you on the last day, if you read it, was my resisting reduction rant. and I invoke Donella Meadows. So I do think there's different layers of intervention. So you have technical interventions, you've got legal interventions, and in the short run, you have to do a lot of these. But I think that the incentives are created based on a paradigm. So we worship billionaires. We believe that capitalism is ultimately a fair way to do a lot of things. And this is actually a paradigm, right? And I think that you see like the Time's Up movement coming, you see the Parkland kids coming, you see a shift in some of the norms of millennials. And so I think though, in the short run, I think we have to do all this stuff. But I think we also should not forget that with climate change coming, with a lot of the problems of the day becoming more and more tightly linked to this cause, which is this rampant, commercially focused, shareholder return-oriented companies. And you see kids starting to say, the majority of them don't want to join companies that don't have a social cause. You see people boycotting things. You see people up in arms about Uber. And so I think that one of the things that, again, you do it, it's an and, not an or, but I think one of the things that we have to remember is that incentives and norms also can change. And this is sort of looking at the Lisigian thing. And the high order bit on that really is, I think there's a feedback cycle. It's slow. But with climate change and the wacky weather and all this horrible news, the kids that are growing up today are like, Dad, what did you do? What made you do this? And they say, oh, it's the incentives. It's these greedy people who worship billionaires, screwed us all up. We got to change stuff. So I think that's, to me, I am going to keep my eye on that ball as in terms of if I'm going to spend energy. I think that's an important one to watch. And also the change is nonlinear. Like there's a class I think that Leslie used to teach, an advanced constitutional law, where even just a period of 5 or 10 years, you'll see the Supreme Court vote one way, and then the norms change and the Supreme Court votes the other way. I mean, I think some of these changes can happen, values changes can happen suddenly, so.
Certainly our own machine learning algorithms to have life imitate art, imitate life, that infer the future from the past can be caught by surprise. You can have a Soviet Union moment where nobody in 1990 thought that 1991 was going to happen, and then it did. And in retrospect, you can see the tectonic forces that were going to push it that way. So I think that's true. The opening part of your remarks and your response to it calls to mind, who's the guy who has the Wu-Tang Clan album? Martin Shkreli, who he jacked up the prices of a bunch of drugs that he owned the rights to jack up the prices of. And when called before Congress, I think his answer is why would I leave money on the table? This is the system. And if I didn't do it, I suppose somebody else would come along and do it, which is the kind of capitalist model, which leads to your observation that ultimately, systemically in that system, you'd want change to come from the outside. You need an outside role player to say, be as efficient as you can, as reflected by scooping up as much as you can, but this is where you can't scoop up more. This is the maximum price, or whatever it is, if it's a life-saving drug. And then Joey pointed out this idea of kind of corporate social responsibility. I would there distinguish between the overall corporate unit and its constituent employees, staff, and community members. I find myself of two minds about corporate social responsibility, because especially when there's only a handful of players and they're really powerful, what if their sense of social responsibility doesn't align to mine? Now I'm having Exxon tell me what's right and wrong. That feels weird. I remember when Walmart, under some pressure, stopped selling a shirt circa 1995, I think it was, that said, someday a woman will be president. And they were just like, we got a bunch of pushback about it, and it's a little edgy. And they stopped selling it. And it's it was their decision to do so, and that meant it wasn't available in a lot of places before Amazon, when you could get it somewhere else. And there's another question whether Amazon should be, as a matter of corporate responsibility, deciding that the one thing they won't sell is, Google Assistant, or whatever it is these days that they're trying to extinguish. On the other hand, thinking about a social responsibility or ethical function for an individual, I think it's really important that most of the people within a company not be fiduciaries to that organism. The lawyers are. They owe certain duties of loyalty, and they have further duties layered on, Hippocratic Oath style, to society to balance their loyalty to the company. But for a typical employee, it is important, if you're going to be Tristan Harris or whoever, to be able to say, and send out a signal that can trigger the regulators, whom you also point out are rarely in the position to identify and deal with the problem before it gets really big. And you mentioned a technology like differential privacy. God bless Cynthia Dwork and the others who cooked that up. Before they cooked it up, nobody would be like, you need to protect this bulk data with differential privacy. They wouldn't know that was an option. And to be able to build those options and show that they are functional and get them in kind of gets back to the role that each of us with our respective kind of talents and comparative advantages can offer with our own compasses to try to build a society that isn't so formulaic as to be like, as long as I stay in my lane and do my thing, it's somebody else's job to worry about it.
And I do think that if you look at designers or even lawyers like AMAC, they have the ability to make decisions in the design.
Yeah.
And they can lean towards social responsibility or not.
Yeah.
And so that's, I guess, my meta point is that you could have these regulations, but also if the values of everyone who work in the company change, you can tell them to try to optimize for something, but they can still add little things that help protect things. And you've got whistleblower on one end, and little changes in the design interface at the other that can guide things.
Well, this seems an appropriately optimistic place to end our exploration, an optimistic one and somewhat, I guess as it turns out, a kind of call to action, or at least a call against inaction. How's that for a somewhat more modest bumper sticker? To recognize from an ivory tower like this the role we can join others in playing in thinking about this stuff, in bringing to bear our special skills and not feeling that unless we've mastered everything, how dare we speak or attempt an answer. That's kind of what we're hoping to do with our work, I think, and inviting you to do with yours. So I think that wraps us up. We're really eager to see what you might produce for your papers or projects. We stand ready not just to kind of help with that, but help you on whatever way stations you find yourselves in, and hope that maybe at the right time we can draw upon you with your, of course, to opt-in consent. We would like to build a permanent mailing list of this group and think of it as kind of the inaugural keystone group of what we hope will be a longitudinally growing
that will begin with a personality test, right?
That will begin with a small personality test. Just accept the app and click through the permissions, and the rest will be yours. But I just want to say what a pleasure it's been, both having an adventure with you, Joey, and working with you all. And I think we also owe a huge debt of thanks to Natalie, to Samantha, to Jordy. Are there others?
In our AV team.
Our AV team, and even to Mike's Catering, which has really made it fun to come by for class. We're really appreciative for all the hard work that's gone into making this kind of unusual class possible. So thank you, and hello online.